Hello, everyone. Let's get started. Welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. I'm Jinhua Zhao, Professor of Citizen Transportation at MIT. Today, really a great pleasure to have three of our MMI Senior Fellows joining us, presenting their research report. As a background, since 2024, we started the program for MIT Mobility Initiative Senior Fellow. Since then, we had two cohorts, 2024 and then 2025. In 2025, we have five people joining us: Carl Kockelman, Adam Grosser, David Zipper, Stephanie Pollack, and Jimmy Tesla. Today, we invite three of them to present their report. And next week, we have the other two, Adam Grosser and Jimmy Tesla, along with the Dan Roos CIS Prize winners, the three-person presenting next week's Mobility Forum. Right. So Stephanie, David, and Kara, all of them have spoken at this forum on various topics. So I wouldn't introduce them again, so we have more time to direct on to the point. So I will invite each of the panelists to give a 30-second highlight, the takeaway point. I'll start with Stephanie, please.
So my research focuses on the fact that we care a lot about state transportation agencies. We expect a lot of them, and we complain a lot about them, but we haven't really defined in any granular way what it is to be an effective state DOT, what you have to be good at, how we can compare state DOTs across states. So my research is really focused at getting more granular in defining the functions that are important to state DOTs, and also looking at within the 51 states, including DC, which ones is it fair to compare to each other because they're similar enough.
Nice. Thank you. Kara?
Only you can prevent traffic deaths. There's a forest fires, a commercial that a lot of people can remember in this country, but yeah, it really comes down to us. And so I'll be talking about newish technologies for enforcement. You know, there are cameras out in DC and New York and many other places, but not in Texas, because one of our senators got a speeding ticket, an automated speeding ticket in the DC area, and then decided that Texas could not have such things. But you and I are not regulated yet on use of our phones for identifying stuff. So I'll be talking a bit about that.
Great. David?
Yeah, I also am looking at its safety. Specifically, I'm interested in the ways that cities can address speeding. And I looked at all the various tactics that are available at the municipal level to curb speeding, which contributes so much to deaths, and interviewed a whole suite of city transportation officials across the country to ask about the politics. I think we know pretty much what works and what doesn't, but we don't really know as much about the political support or controversy around various tactics. And that's what I really wanted to find out with my research.
Wonderful. Before I invite each of them to do the 9 minutes presentation, let me reinforce the norm of this forum. That is, everybody, specifically referring to the audience, contribute one idea. That can be a form of a question to each of the panelists or a comment to their presentation, right? Feel free to type into the chat directly. I already see people, please input in write into the chat your organization, local city, and local time, so we know who the audience are. Now, let me give the floor to David to start the first presentation. David, please.
Okay, let's see if I can share my screen without too much delay here. Okay, can you guys see it?
Yes, you're getting to the present. Yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Perfect. Great. Okay. Well, as I was mentioning, I'm interested in exploring with my research the tactics to reduce urban vehicle speeds. And I think for those who follow road safety, it's pretty obvious why this would be an issue of importance and one of interest to me. The US is really bad at road safety. We have a crash death rate that's several times higher than pretty much every other rich country, and the numbers have been going in the wrong way in the last several decades. Just a few years ago, the U.S. hit a 40-year high in pedestrian crash deaths, and actually also a 40-year high in cyclist crash deaths. I won't be talking about that quite as much. And it's really the pedestrian deaths that have been most galling, I think, in the trends there of the last several decades in the U.S. And the surge in pedestrian deaths is really largely an urban problem. The deaths in rural areas have been relatively stable, but in cities or urban areas, they have really spiked. And so what I was interested in doing is understanding really what is behind that, and looking at ways to curb speeding, because I think many of you may have seen this table before from AAA Foundation. A modest decline in vehicle speed can have an outsized impact on safety. According to this analysis, if the average car is going 39 miles per hour and strikes a pedestrian, 3 out of 4 pedestrians are going to be killed. At 31 miles per hour, it's only half the pedestrians are going to die, and actually 3 out of 4 will survive if it's at 23 miles per hour. So just a few miles per hour slower can make a big difference in survivability, and also potentially just reducing the number of crash deaths or crashes that occur, period, because some drivers going slower will have more time to take evasive maneuvers and avoid the collision in the first place. So what I wanted to do is look at cities. I want to look at what tactics they have available at the urban level to reduce speeding. I didn't really look at state policies or federal policies as well, though there's certainly some things you could talk about there. But at the municipal level, there's a lot that can be done. And just a few examples, you can adjust the infrastructure. You can install a road diet. You could install a speed hump or a speed bump. You can look at enforcement, which could include a burst of police enforcement as well as automatic traffic cameras. And potentially you could reduce the speed limit itself if you want to consider that. And then the bottom left, there's the PSA option, the sort of communication of the supposed danger of speeding and trying to get drivers to slow down that way. And there's some newfangled opportunities such as intelligent speed assist on fleet vehicles that might actually not just slow down vehicles that are owned by the city, but those that are behind them on a street or roadway as well. So I surveyed the academic literature looking at efficacy, which was pretty consistent about these tactics being effective, with the exception of PSAs, which really are not. But they are very context specific, because a road that can be treated with a speed hump is going to be slower than one that is going to really need a road diet, probably because it's an arterial and you can't put a speed hump there, just for example. So doing Apple, it's hard to compare them, but by and large, they're pretty effective. What I really want to get into, and this was the bulk of my research, was understand the politics of these interventions. And because that's really where the obstacle is. I think we know what works. It's not a knowledge gap we have, it's a political gap. So I surveyed 11 city DOT officials or recent DOT officials across the country, cities from 100,000 to 1 million, and basically asked them for their perspectives. And I summarized with Harvey Ball sort of a high level sort of synopsis of what I heard here. There's going to be a lot more information in the report itself, which will come out shortly. But their perspectives on efficacy really did align with what the academic research shows, which is encouraging. A few of these interventions really stood out. Road diets, automatic speed cameras, and adjusting traffic signalization, interestingly, are really, really effective. Speed humps are excellent as well. But if you go on the far right here, I'm going to skip past cost because in the interest of time, with public acceptance, there's a lot of orange here. There's a lot of popularity. This was actually very striking to me that across the board, these interventions were actually quite popular, is what I heard from city DOT officials who were speaking, frankly, off the record, so they could say whatever they wanted. And that was especially notable for some of these interventions involving enforcement with automatic speed cameras and police enforcement, where you see a media narrative sometimes about the controversy around them. But what I consistently heard was that actually the narratives do not match the reality in terms of the level of support from community members, including, especially apparently, in low-income communities, who are clamoring and often requesting more enforcement, as well as other types of interventions that can include speed humps and road diets, which frankly can make sense because low-income communities have the higher levels of crash deaths. So just to hit a few quick lessons before going into, I know we'll have time for some Q&A. Speed countermeasures really are pretty effective, but they're context specific, and what works in one place is not necessarily going to work in another. So at first I was hoping to do more comparisons. I ultimately was able to do of the relative efficacy because there really is a lot of differentiation here. Traffic signal adjustments, speed humps, and road diets are especially powerful. they really stood out both in the academic literature and in terms of what I heard from the city DOT staff across the country. In fact, this actually inspired me to write a couple stories because I do a lot of journalism around transportation. I did one over the summer, All Hail the Humble Speed Hump. It deserves more credit than it gets as a safety intervention. And people really like speed humps too, because they think, frankly, it'll slow down those dastardly people from outside their community who are racing through their own streets. It's really true, actually. And then just this morning, hot off the press, I wrote a story about traffic signalization as an underappreciated way of potentially reducing crashes as well. And then finally, a lot of interventions, including enforcement, are really less controversial than we think. I think this is really important, and I continue to think about lessons from this one in particular. I did write one story about automatic enforcement in particular, titled "It is More Popular Than You Think." I'm going to send out or I will have published the full report very shortly. If you want to get a contact of it, just email me through my website, davidzipper.com. And I'm also going to be discussing it at some length on the podcast I co-host with Wes Marshall, author of Killed by a Traffic Engineer. It's called Look Both Ways with David and Wes.
Very
But
nice.
with that, I will say thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Stephanie and Cara, any quick comments to David's presentation?
I have two quick comments. So one is, I think it's important to think about combinations of interventions, and in particular, changing traffic signal timing without using red light cameras may not be as effective, because if people just run through the newly timed signals, it doesn't matter, right? So the key is not just the signal is retimed, it's that people respect it. And maybe it's because I'm from Massachusetts, but that assumption is not always true. The second point I would make quickly is that one of the things that was sort of a medium efficacy that I think gets a bad rap is actually lowering speed limits. There is an incorrect belief that when you lower speed limits, people don't go slower. When I was in Massachusetts, we had the opportunity to sign some legislation that gave every city and town the right to lower speed limits without getting state approval. And we had some time before Boston lowered its speed limits to 25 miles an hour at the beginning of 2017. So we were able to get IIHS to actually do a case control study with intersections in Boston and intersections in Providence to see if just repainting the sign with a different number actually slowed cars down. And not surprisingly, the result was it does, but not all the way to the speed limit. But going to your point, David, about slowing cars is about not killing people. The percentage of cars exceeding 35 miles an hour when you change the speed limit to 25 dropped 30%. So it didn't go all the way down to 25, but it fell in that range where it could really be the difference between life and death, being hit by a car going 40 and a car that's going slower. So I would sort of make a pitch for upgrading the efficacy of lowering speed limits.
No, point well taken on the speed limit point. I think on the signalization, I actually think I'm pretty excited about this one. So, and I might maybe I'm a little more bullish than you are, Stephanie, because and I went pretty deep into signalization for this story that came out today in Bloomberg. But historically, signalization has really been about throughput, getting as many cars through roadways as possible. And there are ways of using signalization to actually save lives that I think are well known in a few cities, or well known among safety advocates, but are really not very well deployed across the country, like LPIs that make pedestrians more visible, or adjusting the green wave speed, called known as the progression speed, be a few miles per hour slower, so that you can induce drivers to go a bit slower. Overall, traffic in general is a bit slower. These are things that drivers don't even notice, which is especially intriguing because it minimizes pushback and makes it a lot easier to get through compared to something like a road diet or a bike lane that enhances safety but does inspire pushback.
Thanks, David. Cara.
I love the speed hump in front of my house. Oh gosh, I hope you guys can. Yeah, it might freeze a little bit here. I've got a dongle, I've got everything going, but yeah, I really do feel speed humps, roundabouts, great interventions for all sorts of reasons. And yeah, I'm curious to find out what that new article says. So David, if you could put that URL into the chat box for us about how they're using. We have a moderating speed project right now for the Texas DOT, and a few years ago we had a pedestrian-focused safety project. So, and yeah, we're looking forward to sharing more of those results in the months to come.
Sure,
Right
I'll put
on.
it in the chat.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Next, let's move to Stephanie for your presentation. Yeah, Stephanie, please. You're on mute, Steve.
Okay, can folks hear me and
Yeah.
see my slides? Great. As I said, my research focuses on the capacity of state DOTs. So there's been a lot of conversation lately about this concept of state capacity, which is just the ability of government agencies to translate policy goals into actual action and outcomes. Policy doesn't matter unless it's implemented, right? So this is really about how can we use research to understand the ability of the agencies that we task with implementing policy change to actually do it? Historically, in public administration, state capacity research is focused on the national level or sometimes the subnational level, but rarely at the level of the actual implementing agencies. State DOTs are sort of perfect for that kind of research. And the reason is because since they were created by and are in many ways regulated by federal requirements, they're more like each other than other kinds of state agencies. And that heterogeneity makes sort of the question of, can we define what an effective state Department of Transportation looks like? I also just want to briefly connect the concept of state capacity, the concept of abundance, which we talked about at Vision Day. There's a lot of conversation about abundance. This is my little transportation, how to get to abundance, and what stands in the way. So you start with state capacity, like you need an agency that can effectively implement policy. But then on the road to abundance, like we run into permitting issues, procurement issues, red tape issues, right? That detours us over. But the other thing I just want to point out is number 3, which is the other thing that determines whether we move toward abundance versus scarcity, is decision making, which I think is a huge problem in government. Trade-off denial, just the inability to make decisions, can also send you in the wrong direction. So it's not that state capacity alone will get you to abundance. You have to address state capacity. You have to address the red tape issues. You have to address the trade-off denial and waterfall decision making. But my research is focused on the state capacity piece, and particularly on defining and measuring state capacity. And I think there's sort of 3 pieces you have to do to get all the way down the road on that. The first is you have to define what constitutes state capacity at a much more granular level. The second thing is you can't really compare 51 states and just rank them from 1 to 51 on which ones are really good at state capacity. You need to group them so that they're similar enough to each other. And then the last thing you would do once you had agreement on those 2 things is you would then collect data and actually try to come up with rankings. I did not start with step 3 yet. I'm focused. The research that I did for my fellowship year focused on 1 and 2. So let's start with step 1. So what I did is I reviewed all of the literature that did exist, both on state transportation agencies and more broadly on state agencies. Came up with 4 key functions that actually I think apply not just to state DOTs, but apply kind of across the board. And it's not just saying, okay, workforce is important. We all know that. It was trying to get down to very carefully worded goals, which were then not only based on the literature, but I did some mixed methods research and talking to state DOTs and saying, do you agree with this? Can you reword this? So for example, on workforce and talent, it's the ability to recruit, train, and retain a talented, adequately sized, and appropriately compensated workforce. All of those are supported by some combination of research data and conversations with people. Or similarly on procurement, right? Procurement is not just about least cost. It's about strategically selecting consultants and teams that innovate and add value while also staying within budget and delivery. So there's 4 of those. And then there's also, I've identified 8 functions that are specific to state departments of transportation. Things like collaborative planning, right? The ability to plan for the future of the state transportation system, but while working with local, regional, and state agencies and businesses and communities, right? And so planning is not just internal to the state DOT, it's external. Or things like real estate management, which people don't think about a lot, but like New Jersey Transit just released a plan. They own 8,000 acres of developable land, Okay, like state agencies are often the biggest landowners in state government. So that step one was kind of getting us to all of those functions. Step two was how do you group the states in a meaningful way? As I've said before, I tried a whole bunch of different methods that didn't really satisfy me. What I finally did is sort of kept doing slice. So the first slice turned out to be growing states function very differently than states that have stable or even declining population. So the first cut was, is the state growing, which was defined as year-over-year population growth of at least 1% over a 15-year period, which is about, just so you know, that's more than twice the national average. For the country as a whole, states during that period grew at little over half of 1%. The second cut was, was there a meaningful amount of transit going on, which again, sadly, for a state as a whole, if the transit mode share of the commute is 3% or more, that actually puts them very high on transit use, which is unbelievably sad. And then the rural urban divide matters a lot. Density, density within urbanized states makes a big difference. Like even in urbanized states, there are lower and higher density states. And then finally, for rural states, the size of the system they're maintaining, the small and medium rural states are very different than the big sprawly ones. What that lands you with when you're done is 5 groupings, which are shown on this map. Growing states, large rural states, high transit using states, medium density urbanized states, and small and medium ones. And I'm still in the process of talking to some of the states that could have gone into more than one category and checking in to see if states agree, but I actually think this is a pretty good first cut. So in closing, I would just say, if you go out there, maybe not in the published literature, but in the what I would call advocacy literature world, everyone is doing reports ranking states on how good they are and do they get it right and what's the condition of their infrastructure. And those are all really important, and I'll probably use some of the data in step 3, but you have to start from sort of not, many of these reports are like unitary, like there's one thing that matters, like how many bridges are in bad shape or what your greenhouse gases are. And so what I would leave you with is, if we're serious about defining and measuring and comparing states on capacity, it's not enough to just pick the thing you care about, like equity or safety or greenhouse gases. It's really important to think about the universe of things we expect state DOTs to do well and measure all of them.
Very nice. Thank you, Stephanie. And we'll start with Kara for comments. Kara?
Well, driving out here to Boston from Austin, I was just stunned at how small the states are out here. And it seems really duplicative and chaotic to everybody have their own governor and their own DOT. And I just can't believe we function. Yeah, it's astounding to me that we do so well in this mishmash of smaller states out here, and I feel for them. I do think it is duplicative of resources and things like that. So I'd rather see a lot more sharing and consistent. Pennsylvania, I need you to add front license plates, and yeah, it's stunning. You notice these things when you move across these places. Very, very different cultures, and I don't get it. So Stephanie, I hope you can help out with consistency, and smart legislation. We also have real problems when you just drill down to a local level with all the conflicting jurisdictions. And so, for example, autonomous vehicles, who gets to regulate? It's really unfortunate. So there's a lot of mixed signals, and that is slowing a lot of things down. The permitting from utilities to, city streets to neighbors, all of these overlapping jurisdictions, including you and me as private property owners.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. David.
Stephanie, I'm curious. I'm sure you've thought about this, but there's a sort of obvious question after listening to you talk about the need to expand state capacity at state DOTs, which is to say, well, capacity that will be used in what way? Because there is an argument that state DOTs in much of this country are so beholden to the automobile and highway expansion that if you make them more efficient, they're just going to waste still more money on useless highway expansions. And you of all people know all about this because you fought when you were at FHWA with TxDOT over the expansion of that interstate in Houston, I know, which was problematic to say, and is problematic to say the least. So I guess I'm wondering whether it's necessarily a good thing always to make a state DOT more efficient if they're just going to use whatever money they save to do bad stuff.
Oh.
So, I mean, just to quickly respond, that's why we have to define what we want them to do, right? Because the truth is, there was another cut, right? And there's actually three kinds of states on highway expansion. It's actually a small number of very big states doing a lot of highway expansion, right? Most of the highway expansion in this country is actually accounted for by between 3 and 5 states. And then there's about 10 to 12 states that are very progressive, okay? They're doing GHG stuff, they're building bike lanes, they're focused on safety. And then there's like 30 that honestly are neither. They are not completely committed to highway expansion, and they are not completely committed to progressive outcomes. I'm actually the most interested in those. That's where the question becomes, what would it take to kind of change? Because I started a long time ago, and there weren't 10 progressive state DOTs. There were like 2, right? So the question is, like, to me, how we, a lot of people focus on how do you get the half a dozen really bad actors to stop doing what they do. And what I would say is this, they do it because that's actually what their governors and their legislatures want them to do. And by the way, they mostly spend state money on it, not federal money. So I'm more interested in at least 24 states that could be very different in 2035 than they are today, because I know that there are states that are very different in 2025 than they were in 2015. Doesn't mean we should ignore the ones building highways, just means that's not the only question.
Stanley, I'll add one more question along that. At the beginning of the year, when we discussed this research, one purpose is to facilitate the learning between different states, right? The common challenge is to come back from, say, London, from Singapore, and share with the US cities or state. They say, oh, no, Singapore, we cannot learn from Singapore here, right? But you made a very important argument that there are many things we can learn from each other, right? Through your research, which mechanism you start to identify that indeed there's great opportunity, one state can very well learn from the other states?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of ways that the states are, and that's why we're seeing changes, right? One is there are organizations that actually bring together states with common interests. One's called the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and they literally sit in rooms and learn from each other. There is an opportunity for international learning. So I will tell you, Federal Highway has spent over a decade on roundabouts, like doing the work and then introducing state DOTs, and a lot of, we're not where we should be and where Europe is, but there are many more roundabouts in the US than there would have been, but for the federal government nudging states. And then the third thing is that the comparison works. People do care, right? Like I'm not as good or whatever. So there's a group called Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety that just this week put out their annual roadmap to safety. And they have done research and said, here are a bunch of state laws that are clearly associated in the research with better safety outcomes. And then they basically rank all the states, green, yellow, red. How many of these laws have you passed? And it gives state DOTs the ability to go to their legislatures as well as advocates and say, hey, we were only in yellow. We're not a green state on safety, and we all care about safety. You have to help by passing these laws. So there are multiple mechanisms by which you can move the needle once you start to actually compare states to each other and share information about best practices.
And also with your clustering, you can make the peer pressure even sharper on this, right? Thank you, Stephanie. Kara.
Okay, so I'm supposed to pull up my slides here. I'm paying attention to the chat box. Forgive me.
Okay, sure. You can put on this. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So I, have been looking at this topic for a few years. This is not just a mobility fellow thing for me. This is a passion, because I can't believe somebody with a PhD in computer science hasn't solved this problem already for us. So I'm looking for collaborators. I don't have any money, I'm afraid, but how to make all of us basically a cop on the beat reporting bad behavior. And I hope you do this all the time with potholes and anything that, you're noticing around your communities that's wrong and needs needed adjustment. There's a lot of dangerous stuff just even on the sidewalk that you can report. And I do that in Austin with the 411 app. And or is it the 311 app? Forgive me, I think it's the 311 app. So your phone is a very powerful weapon. It was used to help, improve law enforcement in both sides, the supplier and the customer. And it has decibel meters. It doesn't really have a particulate measurement, and it's hard to see smoke if you ever try that with your phone or other toxics that might be invisible to the eye. But there's a lot that you can do, and many of you have dash cams on your vehicles. I know all Uber and Lyft drivers pretty much have forward and backward facing, and Russia for decades has had cameras on their cars because of the corruption in the police forces in Russia. So you would have to pay off people if you were in a crash to have the truth come out about how the crash went, because the person who hit you may pay the officer to say something else. So anyhow, I do feel that we should be using our phones, and I've been having my students look at this. I've been doing crash work for a long time, and as many of you have heard me say, I guess that, we kill people at about twice the rate of our peers. Some of that is speed, some of that is culture, some of that is licensing, and some of that is speed humps. But that brings us back to speed, which David was talking about earlier. And if you look at, how much we walk versus a lot of our peers, and this, I'm going across the Atlantic mostly, but also up to Canada and all the way down to Australia. So those are very peer nations for us because of the vehicle ownership and travel distances in those two very large countries, Canada and and Australia. So I think walking, is kind of the most deadly mode per person mile traveled, but bicycling is the most injurious mode per person mile traveled. And a lot of those crashes don't get reported in the police records. You have to go to the emergency rooms and the doctor's offices to see that. Speeding is just one of many things that contributes to these deaths and injuries and other losses, property damage and such. But it really makes people feel uncomfortable and can reduce the amount of active travel that we do. And we're lucky that, almost half of our states allow for speed cameras, automated speed enforcement, or red light cameras, or both. And if you go, across the pond, or even just across the border or to the north of us, and probably to the south of us, there are a lot of cameras out there. And it's making it very difficult to even exceed the posted speed limit by 1 kilometer per hour in many countries. Here in the US, we do have some speed cameras. They usually don't kick in until about 10 miles per hour above the posted speed limit. So the word limit is not really a true limit. And so smartphones are everywhere, right? They're, a lot less expensive than these camera installations. And you can, report really dangerous driving, and that information can get stored and saved and used as evidence when there is an automated enforcement ticket, or there's a police officer that needs to get involved if they're available. But as I wrote in the chat box, most policing is down on our streets across the US, and American drivers are taking great advantage of that. And that is a product of having fewer people going through the police academies. During COVID, they couldn't have police academies in many places. And of course, with the whole Black Lives Matter, a lot of people did not want to go into that. It's, it's a tough job. You have to wear a lot of gear. I think a lot of our officers wear on the order of 40 pounds on their body. So even though I might like to go into that, I really do not want to walk around with all that gear because of gun ownership permissions and other things in this country. It's a very heavy set of armor that they're having to wear out there. So they're not really enforcing speed very much. It's very expensive to enforce. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars, honestly. But we do know what people are doing thanks to data sets like INRIX. And so one of my students, Kaya Lee, has downloaded, billions maybe of points, and these are all anonymized, so we don't know the license plate associated with them, but you can get a sense. This was just for a particular day, I think in November of 2024. And hopefully many of you have access to the INRIX data through your DOT for research that you're doing. We just happen to have a speed-related project right now in Texas. And so the blue bars are the number of vehicles at those different times of day. And of course, there's very few vehicles out there at late night. And you get actually most of your speeding across the state of Texas between the hours of maybe 2 or 3 and 5 a.m. And then the sun starts coming up and the police start their new shifts, and maybe people are more worried about getting ticketed. That comes down. Of course, congestion comes up. Many more lights are now, a pure red, so they're not flashing yellow, things like that, and that brings speeds down as well during the course of the day. So these are just 85th, 95th percentiles, medians, and averages. But you can focus, of course, on a particular corridor, on a particular day, and gosh, I have another image for you, so we can talk about which days tend to be worst for speeding. And yeah, the weekend actually has, fewer vehicles because a lot of the commercial trucks disappear and people don't have to go to work or school as often. But so you obviously see higher speeds on the weekends, as you can imagine, slightly higher speeds. So this is another image where she broke it out by Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you see your Saturday and Sunday with those orange bars coming down on the weekend by about 15% in terms of vehicles out there on the road, at least in the INRIX data, which they don't try to balance across vehicle types, but they do feel that they have a pretty fair share of commercial or larger vehicles in the mix. It's not just GM light duty, late model year vehicles in there. And you're seeing the spikes in that green, which is the percent speeding, as well as the spikes in the blue and the purple, again, in those early morning. And if this is now compared everybody to their own posted speed limit, which might be a local street. So this is the entire network, if you can believe it, that includes local streets that people like you and I might live on in Texas. And again, the percentage of people that are going above 30% above the posted speed limit, or 15% above the posted speed limit, or simply above the posted speed limit is quite high in that early morning. And even though lighting is very limited at that time of day. And I don't think there's much of a pattern across days of the week, which is interesting to me, because a lot of young males get the car keys on, and I have one myself. They might be able to go out late at night with their friends and try to do some crazy stuff out there on a late Friday night, early Saturday morning, or late Saturday night. So it's, about half the drivers are above the posted speed limit in this country. In Europe, they wouldn't stand for that. That would be a ton of tickets, as you can imagine. That would come down right away. But our posted speed limits are rarely ticketed at that level. And then if you look at the lower posted speed limit roads, that's where most of it's happening. So you're seeing, across times a day, not just in the early morning, you're getting about a 43% above it. And on the higher speed roads, let's say a 60 mile per hour signed road, you're getting about 37% above it. So we thought that was really interesting, but that's pretty recent. Over the past couple of years, Kaya and some other students, including those with much more computer science expertise than I would normally have on my team, have been using large language models and other AI techniques, computer vision basically. And we're lucky that Songjon Choi and Puya Parsa at the University of Minnesota have stepped in to help us. We don't have funds, but we know that there are people out there that can do this, and we'd love for you to look at the code. We'd like to make it open source for people to improve on, so that we can have apps and just code offline that's reading the submissions by people without any human intervention, and just pushing out to the law enforcement agencies. So, there's no public shaming or anything. It's just going directly to authorities, since they're the ones to help tackle this, rather than you and me acting as enforcement agents. But as you can imagine, there's been a lot of plate reading. Flock cameras famous for that, but there's standard LPR technologies. Speed is tricky with cameras. Generally, speed is policed using radar. And I was just this morning on the phone with Novoa Global, who does this for the District of Columbia or Washington, D.C. But yeah, you can get a lot of information. You can get make and model, and sometimes people change their plates, right? If they're planning to commit a crime, or they hide many of the numbers. And this has been happening in New York with a lot of their speed cameras, let's say. And so you could get a lot more information and kind of pinpoint who it must be. And of course, you could identify other things like a missing headlamp, or, an oversized vehicle, or somebody who rides the center line. There's a lot more you can do than speed. But DC's been doing not just speed, but red light, stop sign, bus lane violations, passing school buses. So bus lane violations are really if you're in the bus stop. So, people are clogging those bus stops. And then there's some sites where if you're too tall, they don't want high trucks trying to navigate on pavement that's not designed or on quiet streets that aren't wanting such heavy vehicles or large vehicles in front of their homes and businesses. So they have the most expertise, I think, right now. New York State, of course, is great with the automated speed enforcement and some other things, but it's not cheap. Those installations, and they're using the existing posts and poles in and electricity lines in DC, and it's still like $3,000 a month or more for each site. And DC is really nice. David, I think you'll appreciate this, and Stephanie, you too, that they have a rule where all you need, the ticket goes to the vehicle owner. You don't need to know who it is that's driving. And as you can imagine, it's very hard for you and me to see who's driving. And if they are going to take a picture and get that at night, they have to have lighting that shoots on. So the person who gets the ticket actually knows that they were probably captured on camera because of the light that is thrown at them to take an image through that front windshield. But that is a more expensive installation. And so this is really expensive, whereas you and I, we have our phones with us a lot of the time. And, we have a passenger in the car who could be taking it, or we have a dash cam where we're walking and we're seeing really awful behavior and can report that pretty easily. You could also do it, I suppose, with individuals who aren't in a vehicle. Little tricky with e-bikes and stuff. They don't have plates on them. That's pretty hard to identify those kinds of people. But you can imagine, I mean, we should, get officers aware of where the violations are occurring in a great amount so that they can get people on the ground for those that can't be identified remotely. And DC DOT, COVID was a really tough period. DC DOT is a really small site. I think they have about one camera every 9 square miles, so even though this sounds like a lot of cameras, it's like a 3 by 3 mile or 9 square mile area where you'd have one camera, and they have people driving in from all over the country and violating laws there. So they have to get quickly to a full list of vehicle plates to issue those tickets. And there was some, I think, newspaper articles about how they weren't collecting. So now they have loosened their laws on and to go after the high ticket violators. And they also do, we highly recommend that you start with a very low level ticket, but all their tickets are pretty much $100 now, which is a lot better than the speeding ticket I once got on I-35, So I think, I would usually advocate for quite low levels and $0 in the warning phase, unless it's an egregious violation. And of course, there's a lot more you could do. There's emissions, there's noise. This is an emissions monitor in the lower left. It doesn't come on your phone, but some of you have purple air quality monitors, and you can just go to the Purple Air Quality app or website and see what the real air quality is all over the US, because there are people who are buying those because they have children with asthma, or they're just environmental engineers or whatever. They paid the $300 and you can get a sense of how air quality is, but you can also probably do some street level sampling as diesel vehicles go by. Oversized vehicles, those are kind of easy to identify. I talked about bus stops and school buses, but parking, that's a long-term. A lot of us get parking tickets, and the imagery that they have just shuts up the vehicle owner, because it's really clear that was a violation, even though you thought you parked legally. And so just on the emissions side, heavy duty trucks tend to be diesel, unfortunately. And so it's a really fine particulate matter that causes reduced lifespan for a lot of Americans. And in New York, they're asking people to please submit video. You have to be careful how you take that, because it's 3 minutes. So the driver, might come and hassle you if he or she knows what you're doing. And so people are pretty covert about it, and they're making money. So I hope you'll write me if you have any suggestions. I'll be looking at the chat box for all of your top picks. And, we will be writing reports on this and hope to see you all at TRB.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kara. Stephanie, David, some comments?
Yeah, actually, I have a number of questions. I guess maybe I'll have two
Just the
questions.
30-second version, okay?
Yeah, 30-second version. That's fair enough. Maybe I'll just focus on Texas, where you're from, because the automatic enforcement's not going to happen there for speed, as far as I can tell, anytime soon. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about an alternative strategy that could involve intelligent speed assist on fleets, where you basically are able to get some sort of a threshold number of vehicles that are programmed to adhere to the speed limit, and in so doing, they basically force traffic to at least some extent to go the speed limit as well. And of course, the city fleets themselves could have ISA, as well as potentially some corporations that are interested in that, what have you. I'm wondering if you think ISA has a future in road safety in a red state like Texas in that way, to curb speeding.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going to get the fleet manager, and I really don't think that, you're going to have enough vehicles obeying the speeds. I mean, you and I can try to do it with our friends and see how well that works, but a lot of people will get upset and they'll try to weave through us, and so you can, end up creating.
I mean, to weave through the ISA enabled vehicles, is that what you mean?
Oh, so ISA, I've had it when I rented a vehicle in Poland and Germany recently. And I mean, all it does is flash. So it tells you what the speed limit is, which I think is super important. So most people,
That's passive ISA. There's active
right.
ISA, which actually restricts the speed. That's what I'm
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about. My question is
Yes.
if fleets could install active ISA to a degree in Texas, that they actually would prevent speeding because traffic flows would be slower.
So most trucks are governed, as far as I understand, the heavy duty vehicles, because the owners don't want their employees getting in crashes and then they come back to the company for the payout. Okay, so it's a very common. So those are governed. I don't think they really help much. Just that's like about 5 to 10% of the vehicles out there, unless you're in a special corridor, like a trade corridor, like I-35. And so, yeah, those big vehicles like governing the speed or commercial vehicles, I don't think it's going to happen. I drive around Waymos in Austin a fair bit, and it is pretty, unfortunate when you've got two of them side by side and they will not go over the posted speed limit, whereas the Teslas will. But there are people working on trying to smooth traffic to avoid shockwave behavior and early congestion in corridors. So I actually was just talking with Kathy Wu's group the other day. So she works a lot on that here at MIT.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, I just want to second a comment, Kara, that you made, which is in the comments, which is it's not an either or, right? Like we should have vehicles that are safer, that are self-limiting on speed, that are built to be safer, all those things. But like, it's not going to, I mean, there's no interest in Congress or at the federal level in doing that now. And it's like a decade after you put those regulations in where you actually see them in the fleet. And we should have self-enforcing roads. Like roads should all be built to make it really, really hard to go fast, right? And we're getting more of those. But again, we're not going to get every mile of rural and urban arterial in the US to be built that way over any particular period of time. So the way I see it, enforcement is always going to have to be part of the safety approach. And I just, so therefore, what I don't hear you saying we should all be reporting it instead of, but it's in addition to safer vehicles and safer roads. We need enforcement. There's never going to be enough cops. We all love speed. We on this call all love speed cameras, but politically they have been a heavy lift in a bunch of places. I will note that I worked really hard when I was at Federal Highway to put out a speed camera guide, in part at the request of cities and states who said we need to put the federal imprimatur on speed safety cameras so that we can use it in the political conversations. It was taken down from both the NHTSA and Federal Highway websites by the current administration. So
yeah, I think Cafe was destroyed yesterday. So thanks for
Cafe
that.
was blown up yesterday. But so some form of citizen enforcement, I just think is a really important tool for the foreseeable future to supplement, not to replace all the other great work that people are doing to make vehicles and roads safer.
And
right?
it's not enforcement, it's assistance. It's just reporting. It may be result in warnings, little investigations, depending on how egregious or how frequent it is. Of course, you don't want people ratting on somebody they hate that they're trying to hurt, maybe a former boyfriend, girlfriend situation. So if it's coming from the same phone, so revealing your identity, as well as, your ISP for the port that you're connecting with, those kinds of things can weed out some of those issues. But one thing that I worry about, and maybe some of you here, the hundreds of you with us, can help me with this one. So if I live at a home and there's a lot of these kids speeding home after school each day and I'm taking pictures and they can tell where I probably have the camera. So are they going to come egg my home, or hurt me? That is the concern. Generally, if I'm away from my home, I feel less, ill at ease from submitting. But yeah, if they see you parked there, just like with those diesel trucks in New York City, that would be a concern for me. So if any of you have thoughts on
Yeah.
that.
Well, one last comment before I give to John for question. Moving from this cross-sourcing data to the potential for the collective enforcement, right? Just want to give one example. John and I, we were traveling Japan. We're on the subway in Tokyo. We were chatting. We're not too loudly, just like Carrie chatting. This one lady stand up and come to us says, John Jinghua, you shouldn't talk. We were like a little bit surprised. And then later very much respected that. That's how collective make the system running on that, right? That's all. Back to you, John.
Super. Okay. Before we get to the hundreds of questions in our exploding chat today, I just want to give the floor to Stephanie for 45 seconds to articulate your comment about lighting, because I think it was a really important comment. Can you just repeat what you said in the chat for everyone in case anyone missed it?
Very quickly, this is where we really need to look at data because 1/4 of driving takes place at night and 3/4 of fatalities take place when either it's completely dark or near dark, and no one is taught how to do lighting. And so I would just say, in addition to safe roads and safe speed limits and citizen enforcement and all those other stuff, this is an example of sometimes we just miss some of the most important things we could be doing if we care about safety because we haven't really looked at the data. And so if it's not on your top 5 list as the chat is doing it, lighting places better is a huge safety issue that we invest almost nothing in.
And I would say compounded by the issue of incredibly bright headlights, as anyone who's driven a car in the past 10 years understands, also coming from vehicles that are operating at a much higher headlight height, shining right into the eyes of several oncoming cars and so forth.
Yes, and real quickly, I would just say a lot of people are like, okay, but dark is 2 o'clock in the morning. Where I am sitting right now, it will be dark in 3 hours when kids get out of school.
Exactly. So Matthias Gibson mentioned roundabouts and rotaries that didn't come up too much in the conversation. I want to couple that with a question from Eddie Wilson, very interesting, which is essentially, are we playing whack-a-mole? In other words, so the question reads, curious if you've seen some unexpected externalities. In Denver, there are some roads with speed humps and roundabouts, which definitely slows traffic on those roads, but it seems like more vehicles go to the roads they can drive faster a block or two over. It makes those roads feel more congested and dangerous. This is all anecdotal, so I'd be interested in what the research says. Any responses from any of the three of you on this comment of sort of pushing the problem somewhere else?
Well, I'll comment, but I'm going to give Stephanie credit because when we were talking about, my topic of curbing urban vehicle speed at the beginning of this year, she said, well, you know what? When you start getting into speed humps, David, people are going to say they love them because they think they're just going to take all those dastardly speeders and make them go on that other street that's 1 block away, which I thought was constructively cynical. And I appreciated the point. So when I was talking with city DOT staff, I actually asked that exact question, like, are you observing this? And the answer I got, and actually two of them had measured this to see if speed humps led to diversion, and they said no. They said that that actually does not happen. They said that you do get people supporting speed humps because they think they will drive the traffic elsewhere, but that is not what they have observed in their data. But I should give Stephanie a chance to come back and say that they're wrong because she loves to argue, I know.
So, in a world where people use Waze, anything that slows your trip will eventually trip the algorithm and you will be diverted. Speed humps, hawk lights, rotaries, right? We've all experienced that if it's 5 seconds faster, right, it will give you directions somewhere else. And so I just have to say, in a world where a growing number of people are just slavishly following what is on their screen, ignoring, right, network effects of things that slow travel is stupid, because it's not that people divert, it's that they're following instructions from algorithms that are nearly 100% based on travel time. So until we get smarter algorithms, we have to think about this.
Super. Okay, over to you, Kara. So, quick question from Joe Conray. How is this Texas overspeeding data captured? But just to build on that, Chris Van Dan Elzen asked a question. This speed data seems to imply that the road speed tends to fluctuate with traffic density. It would argue for variable speed limit signs. Is there data that links the time of day, road density to fatalities on these same roads? So quickly, how was the data captured that you presented, and what do you think about variable speed limit signs?
Yeah, so the data across the US and many other places in the world, they were using location-based service data for a while, but those pings are not very frequent unless you're in a nav app, like the kind that Stephanie was just talking about. But the INRIX, so GM thought that, we were going to have a dedicated short-range communication requirements with basic safety messages, and they were already putting a lot of this technology on their vehicles, and I think all Teslas have it, and many other higher-end vehicles have it, but only GM really was trying to monetize it, and so it goes through a third party to anonymize these regular pings about every 3 seconds, sometimes 1 second. So it's better than a lot of cell phone data and that kind of thing. It's pretty accurate, and so then they usually aggregate that in a data set that the University of Maryland puts up at the tech, but you have to have a license, so you have to pay for this data. INRIX can also give you access to the breadcrumb data, which is big data, so it's a lot. So not too many people work with it, but we are working with it, and I just showed you a week of about 5 to 10% of the vehicles in Texas on any Texas road in front of your house. And so if it's a low volume street, it's not a lot of vehicles, but you're seeing one vehicle moving through there, and you're seeing exactly where he is. We also have, a lot of people have the insurance apps on their phone, and they, I guess that's also about 5 to 10%. I heard yesterday from a woman over at Cambridge Mobile Telematics, and so very similar sample shares, and they are now providing a product which tells a DOT or a city, where is the most speeding happening, where is the most harsh cornering, as well as harsh braking happening. And none of those is a perfect, proxy for crashes, let's say, but it is really eye-opening, the times of day, the days of week, the corridors where maybe your speed limits are too low, or maybe you have something in the way that you didn't realize could cause a lot of harsh braking, and where should you maybe put your police for some dedicated efforts or some mobile signs. In terms of variable speed limits, the only time I've really heard about that, so let me know what you're thinking exactly in that chat box, please, but is for where you reduce the Autobahn speed limit to try to avoid going into level service F. So you're trying to harmonize traffic flow, and you don't want people doing this, which is why I got my speed ticket on I-35, by the way. They have a purposefully low speed limit for a very nicely designed piece of infrastructure that was designed for like 80, but it's 55 or 60. And so as an expert in the design of highways and somebody who hardly ever sees speed limits. I thank God my newest vehicle actually tells me what the speed limit is, because I don't really know what the speed limit is in most places. I don't choose to memorize the street map, and I'm often on streets I haven't been on in a long time. And so I really think just knowing what the speed limit is, having it flash at us, is enough to stop a lot of us from overdoing it, but not our 18-year-old kids, especially of the male persuasion. We see a lot of really bad behavior, and we see a lot of novice driving. And I think Jamie Tesler can tell you more about that next week too.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Super
quick shout out to Cormac McKay. Great comment about what's happening with dash cam uploading in the UK. Please have a look. And finally, my apologies to all of you, because there were some really great questions that started coming in immediately, David, when you started speaking, and continued. So please do have a look at the chat file, which we will share with you.
That's wonderful. We are 103. Sorry to cut it. We squeezed 3 brilliant research into one session there. So thank you for allowing this. And also, there are 3 different research. I really see a lot of coherency and interaction between the 3 reports here. So I'm so glad we put it together on this. So everybody, please join me. Thanks, Stephanie, David, and Carol for the presentation and conversation today. Thank you so much.